Hello, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So glad to be with you all today at the end of this most recent holiday weekend. I'm going to give about 30 more seconds for folks to join, and then we will get started. So just hang tight. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Joey Lindstrom with the field team here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you all so much for joining our weekly call of the HoUSed campaign. And thank you for your support of these efforts to achieve housing that is universal, stable, and affordable for everyone. We've got a great agenda for you today. We'll start with Build Back Better Act update and some thoughts on next steps from Sarah Sadian, who leads our policy team here at NLIHC. We'll also discuss some American Rescue Plan Act resources, specifically as they address the needs, the housing needs of survivors of domestic violence from Kate Walls and the National Housing Law Project. Then we'll hear about emergency rental assistance and some spending updates from Sophie Seebach-Glover on NLIHC's Erase team. But then we'll get to some very interesting field updates from Paige Looney of the West Virginia Coalition to End Homelessness, Margaret Haltom from Neighborhood Preservation, Inc. in Tennessee, and Bree Sillery of the New Mexico Coalition to End Homelessness. Before we get it all started, I'd like to remind everyone that this session is recorded and that we send out the recording with our follow-up wrap-up and links tomorrow as a follow-up email. And we will also be answering your questions throughout the conversation today. So please feel free to post questions in the Q&A box or the chat box, but we definitely prefer that you post questions into the Q&A. So without further ado, I would like to call on Sarah Sadian from NLIHC's policy team to share an update about what's going on in Capitol Hill and potentially passing the historic investments of the Build Back Better Act. Sarah, please take it away.
Hey, everybody. It's so nice to be with you today. Like last week, there's not a ton of updates on Build Back Better, but I will go over where things are now and where we see things going and what you can do to advocate for these historic resources. So unfortunately, the Build Back Better Act is still in limbo, which means that the historic investments that all of us have been pushing for in rental assistance, public housing, and housing trust fund are also in limbo. And that's because Senator Manchin announced in mid-December that he wasn't going to vote for the bill as it was currently written. But we don't necessarily know how it needs to be written in order to get his support. I'll talk a little bit about that more in a second. But from now until, following MLK Day, which was yesterday, this whole week, Congress plans to focus on voting rights. They plan to hopefully hold a vote before the end of the week. Next week, both the House and the Senate will be on recess. So the very soonest when we can see Congress start to engage publicly on Build Back Better is going to be January 31st when they return to DC. I mentioned before that Senator Manchin has said he wouldn't vote for the bill. Well, it's a little unclear what he would vote for at this point, which makes it very difficult for us to anticipate where housing investments lie when it comes to this bill. I think there are plenty of signs, however, that our housing investments are at risk of either being eliminated or deeply cut, which means that we have a lot of work ahead of us to make sure that we can keep our investments as is going forward. The reason why I think housing investments are at risk are for a couple of reasons. One, because Senator Manchin, right after blowing up the bill in December, sent his own proposal to the White House for $1.8 trillion, a proposal he has since rescinded and has taken back. But that proposal did not include housing specifically. I don't think it's because Senator Manchin has an axe to grind when it comes to housing, but it's certainly not on his radar or one of his top priorities. So we have some work there. It's also unclear what sort of changes would need to be made to get Manchin on board and what what effect that can have on housing. So for example, if Senator Manchin were to push for permanent funding of the child tax credit for the full 10 years that are allowed under budget reconciliation, that could eat up about 1.4 trillion of the overall $1.8 trillion package, which would leave very few resources for other priorities like housing. And then finally, it's a little unclear about what President Biden and the White House would accept in terms of negotiations. We've mentioned this before, but the longer this gets stretched out, the more it gets pushed towards the midterm elections. We might see that President Biden and congressional leaders are willing to accept anything that Senator Manchin proposes, even if it doesn't include housing. So that's why it's really important that we're continuing to engage with our members of Congress on Build Back Better and to keep up our advocacy on housing resources. It's important for them to know that these housing resources are important to their community. And it's also important that they're hearing from housing advocates and not just advocates who work in other sectors like the childcare space or the environmental space. They need to be hearing from housing advocates, or else our silence will make it easier for them to cut housing resources from this bill. It's important as you're reaching out to your member of Congress, not just ask them for their support for housing. We know 49 senators and all the Democratic caucus in the House, they support these housing investments. The ask really is for them to be weighing in with the White House and weighing in with leadership in support of these housing resources. We know that decisions are going to be made at the very highest levels. It is very likely that just Senator Manchin, Senator Schumer, folks from the White House might be in the room when negotiations are taking place. They need to know going into those negotiations that there's a broad amount of support for housing investments from their caucus. I also want to speak a little bit about appropriations, since we have another opportunity to expand housing resources there. And of course, I'm sure you agree with me that Congress needs to use every single opportunity that they can to make housing affordable to people who have the greatest needs. What's at stake with this appropriations process this year is an additional 125,000 vouchers for families with the lowest incomes. Congress is currently at a standstill. They have a continuing resolution that is funding the federal government through February 18th, but negotiations are already taking place at the highest levels in the Appropriations Committee over what they can agree to for total spending for next year and how much spending will be for affordable housing. It could make a big difference if there's enough funding that's provided to pass the House bill. That means that HUD programs would have about $7 billion more in funding this year than last year. And it means we would have 125,000 new vouchers for households who need it. If the bill doesn't go as far and is only funded at the levels that the Senate provides, we could see much smaller resources being provided to HUD, although more than last year, but it wouldn't include that major expansion of rental assistance. So I want to encourage all of you to please keep reaching out to your members of Congress, urging them to pass a final spending bill soon, and to use that opportunity to pass the House proposal for 125,000 more vouchers. Unlike all of our work on Build Back Better, which entirely deals with Democrats, appropriations is someplace where if you have Republican senators or representatives, you have an important voice in this advocacy. I want to make sure that I highlight that for all of you. And then lastly, I just want to mention it's not a huge focus of the House campaign, but I am really excited to announce that Diane Yentel, our president and CEO, will be testifying tomorrow morning before a subcommittee on the House Financial Services Committee. She's going to be testifying about disaster recovery efforts and how we need to center those efforts around racial equity and equity for historically marginalized populations. If you have a chance to check in, it'll be at 10 a.m. Otherwise, we'll report back to folks through our memo to members and other resources to let you guys know how it goes. And with that, I will turn it back to Joey.
Thanks so much, Sarah, for that excellent update of what's going on Capitol Hill, as always. I've seen a couple of questions in the Q&A box that I'll ask you here. The first is from Amanda Klein. Do you see Congress piecing out Build Back Better Act into separate legislation, and what would that look like for housing?
That's such a great question. I'm so glad Amanda asked that, because it's definitely something that some Democratic members of Congress are advocating for. But if we see that happen, that is not good for housing. The reason why I say that is because the only thing that is going to pass on Build Back Better is whatever makes it into the budget reconciliation process. That's the process that allows Democrats to pass it with just 50 votes instead of regular order, which needs at least 10 Senate Republicans. If they start splitting off housing or other resources from the budget reconciliation bill, that's a really clear message that those resources are not going to pass. We do not think that there are 10 Republican senators who would vote for that legislation. It's a clear way of killing off those resources. So we need to push back on that as much as possible. So if you're hearing your members of Congress advocate for breaking up the bill into smaller pieces, remind them that the only way this gets done is if housing is on the budget reconciliation bill on Build Back Better.
Thanks. That's a great and important answer, Sarah. We also have a question from Andy Height in Wisconsin, which is, given the morass and the delay over Build Back Better Act, is there a chance of extending the 18 months for emergency rent assistance for people who might need that rent assistance moving beyond?
Yeah, another great question. Something I didn't mention earlier is that Congress may pass additional COVID relief dollars and attach that to the appropriations bill when it moves in February or March. Again, those resources have to come with bipartisan support. So we're expecting it to be very narrowly focused on healthcare provisions, testing, maybe some other things. I do not think that there's going to be any additional resources on housing in that COVID relief bill. I also think it's highly, highly unlikely that we would get Republicans to agree to extend the maximum amount of assistance households can receive under the program. If you remember, when ERA 1 was passed by Congress in December 2020, Republicans insisted on there being a maximum amount of assistance at 15 months. It was only when Democrats passed their American Rescue Plan dollars that they extended that to 18 months. So the idea of going further beyond 18 months, I think, is going to be very difficult. I'll also say that at a certain point, we need to, I know all of you on this call have been focused on long-term solutions that go beyond emergency rental assistance. I think, all of us are aware of the fact that evictions were a crisis before the pandemic. They're going to be a crisis after that. And so it's important that we're also putting pressure on Congress to pass long-term solutions, not just emergency resources. So that means fully funding vouchers so that it's universal, building more housing that's affordable to people with the lowest incomes, but also passing permanent emergency rental assistance resources for whenever a household faces an emergency like a broken down car, let alone a pandemic.
Thank you, Sarah, for that answer. And we've got a third question that's come in, and I think I know the answer to this one. Cedric Harris is asking, is it possible for the White House or other leadership to find 1 or 2 Republicans to come on board for Build Back Better Act so that Joe Manchin is no longer needed?
I would love that personally, but there is zero chance that that's going to happen. Right now, Republicans are pushing back on this bill. They don't want to pass it. It's not because they don't support maybe individual items that are in the bill. We know there's bipartisan support for some housing resources, but I cannot see it happening on this bill. So the only path forward is really to convert Senator Manchin into being a supporter and to keeping all of our other senators and representatives who are Democrats strongly supporting housing resources and communicating that with leadership in the White House.
Sarah, I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, but Jared Smith just asked in the chat box, what's the overall cost or estimated cost of universal vouchers? Great
question. Several years ago, I believe the CBO did a score, and I think they pegged it at about $150 billion phased in over 10 years. But I'd have to double check on that. I haven't taken a look at that report for a while now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Take a look, Sarah. We're going to move on in our agenda now, but please take a look at the Q&A box and the chat box for other questions that you can answer. I'd like now to talk a little bit more about some of the uses of American Rescue Plan Act. And to do so, we are very fortunate to have with us Kate Walls, who is a senior staff attorney with the National Housing Law Project. Kate, it would be great if you could share your update.
Great, happy to. Thanks for having me today. So I'm going to talk about emergency housing vouchers, and in particular, how they can be used by survivors of violence. So under the American Rescue Plan Act, $5 billion were allocated for emergency housing vouchers, which results in about 70,000 EHVs. In May of 2021, HUD issued an operations notice, PIH 2021-15, and it said in effect, it intends for these EHVs to operate like housing choice vouchers, but for them to be low barrier, which is particularly important for the populations that the EHVs are intended to serve, which include homeless individuals, individuals at risk of homelessness, survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and trafficking, who are fleeing, attempting to flee, or moving as a result of the violence, persons who are recently homeless or where rental assistance will prevent their homelessness, or who are at high risk of housing instability. I want to make one note about victims of trafficking. If you're familiar with the Violence Against Women Act, you will know that they are not covered under VAWA. So it's an important inclusion of that population for emergency housing vouchers. The continuums of care and their partners are to determine eligibility for these vouchers and then refer to the area public housing authorities. In this notice, HUD also states that housing authorities can use emergency housing vouchers to effectuate emergency transfers, which are part of the 2013 Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, that if you are currently living in housing covered by the Violence Against Women Act, you may be eligible for an emergency transfer if there's a credible imminent threat of harm against you on the premises, or you've experienced a sexual assault on the premises. Under this notice, HUD is saying to PHAs, you can use this pot of vouchers to transfer victims of violence who are living in public housing and would be otherwise eligible for an emergency transfer. You can instead give them an emergency housing voucher. Housing authorities should have emergency transfer plans. They've been required to have those emergency transfer plans for some time, and that should explain how you can apply for the transfer, which under this circumstance means you could also be applying for an emergency housing choice voucher. Now, it's important to note that the language in the notice says that a housing authority may use EHVs for transfers, not that they shall. So there may need to be some advocacy at the local level to encourage your PHA to do this. It's also important to note that the focus is on survivors who are unsafe or traumatized who live in public housing, and it doesn't necessarily cover the other categories of VAWA covered housing and those individuals who may need an emergency transfer. However, you could potentially work with the COC and the PHA to include that population or to prioritize them as part of the planning process. HUD also notes in this effort to create more of a low barrier process with EHVs that while the immigration requirements imposed in the Housing Choice Voucher Program are the same for the Emergency Housing Voucher Program, there is some greater flexibility to reflect sort of the reality on the ground if you are an immigrant applicant, and importantly, if you're an immigrant survivor. So as part of 2016 guidance issued under the Obama administration, there was a determination made that VAWA self-petitioners are eligible for HUD-assisted housing. And this includes when they have an application pending, including through any appeal of the denial of that application. They are eligible for HUD-assisted housing. So in the operations notice for EHVs, HUD said that immigrant applicants, including VAWA self-petitioners, can certify that they meet the eligibility requirements. And that means that they are in an eligible category as a US citizen or eligible immigrant applicant, and that they are making efforts to secure a Social Security number. Now, the second issue of Social Security numbers can be tricky, especially for VAWA self-petitioners. It's very hard for them and essentially out of their control as to when they will get their Social Security number, which is a condition of being in HUD-assisted housing. HUD is now saying, under the operations notice, that it will waive the Social Security number requirement in terms of the family does not have to provide the Social Security number at application. They can provide it within 180 days from the date of admission or an extension granted by the housing authority if there's evidence that they've made a good faith effort to secure the Social Security number. In the case of a VAWA self-petitioner where they don't have control over the timing of when they would get the Social Security number, advocates could make the argument that they are deemed to be making a good faith effort to secure that Social Security number. HUD has also issued further clarification in the form of FAQs, and you should look at HUD's website because it's continually updating those frequently asked questions on EHVs. But HUD clarified what fleeing or attempting to flee means and provided additional guidance. HUD essentially said it is in the eye of the survivor if they meet that definition of fleeing or attempting to flee. And it's based upon their belief of imminent harm, including where a sexual assault has occurred within the last 90 days, and they are experiencing some level of trauma. Again, this sort of broader understanding and flexibility we think can be helpful to survivors as a whole. And I think I'm seeing questions coming into the chat.
Yes, Kate, thanks for that excellent information. And we do have a lot of really interesting questions. One of the first ones I want to raise is from Elizabeth Bazzini, which is about what about high rents that are beyond what a voucher will pay? Is there any process through emergency vouchers that is different that allows people to use them in high rent areas?
So emergency housing vouchers are subject to the same rent formula as regular housing choice vouchers. And so they may be eligible for exception payments above the payment standard. And that is so that an individual with an emergency housing voucher can compete in that market based upon what the market demands.
Great, thanks so much. And I'll add to that answer that at NLIHC, we've been working hard on small area fair market rents for several years, which we think can be a potential solution to make vouchers more readily used in areas where rents are above the voucher payment standard. I want to flag for you, Kate, a question that came in from Michael Santos, who's asking, are there any model PHAs out there that you think are doing a decent job or a good job of facilitating transfers of emergency housing vouchers?
And I appreciate the question coming from Michael. At this point, we're still looking, we're still looking for those model PHAs. I think they're, I think part of the challenge has been that victim service providers around the country traditionally did not always have deep relationships with their continuums of care. And particularly in communities of color, where it may not be an identified victim service provider, but a culturally specific organization that's doing important work for survivors of color in the community, and that they haven't been connected traditionally to the COCs. And so there's still this gap in prioritization on that end from the COC end. And then as well, because the language in the notice in terms of PHAs is sort of giving them the option to use these vouchers for survivors of violence who need emergency transfers. We haven't seen PHAs step up as the model as of yet, and really making that a reality.
Thanks, Kate. That's really helpful. And Josephine McNeil asked, are all PHAs able to access emergency vouchers? Are there requirements for which PHAs can use them and can't?
That's a great question. So there was an award issued of the PHAs. So it's not all PHAs around the country have emergency housing vouchers. There was awards that were issued to those PHAs. A few PHAs turned those awards back in, and those were reallocated.
Okay, great, thank you. Jenna Hampton asks if there is any data breaking down where the emergency housing vouchers are going, to what type of households, and is there a breakdown of survivors of violence versus homeless individuals?
That's another great question. I have not seen data to date on where the EHVs are going to, but there are data collection requirements as part of the operations notice that was issued last May. So it's information that we will be getting, but it's also a question I can pose back to the National Network to End Domestic Violence, who's leading the conversations with HUD to see if they've got some initial information on sort of the percent of survivors of violence who are able to use these EHVs.
Okay, thank you so much, Kate. Please do stick around and take a look at the chat box and the Q&A box for other questions that you might be able to answer. Before I move us along in our agenda, I will share with everyone that earlier in the call, I asked Sarah a question that had been submitted by Jarrett Smith about estimating the cost of universal vouchers. And Sarah gave the best number off the top of her head, but then went in and actually provided some links in the chat box that give that number more precisely. So everybody, if you're interested in that issue, please take a look at what's going on in the chat box. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our next presenter, which is NLIHC's own Sophie Seebach Glover from our research team, to talk about some of the emergency rental assistance spending that we've seen happening throughout the country. Sophie, take it away, please.
Thanks, Joey. You can go to the next slide. Last week, the Department of the Treasury released updated reallocation documents that detail which grantees has had funds recaptured and which grantees voluntarily gave up funding, as well as where the funding went. And I posted these links in the chat if you want to look into the data a bit more. I also posted NLIHC's fact sheet on reallocation in case people still have questions about what the process looks like. Next slide. As a reminder, Treasury is statutorily required to reallocate ERA1 fund money from grantees with excess funds to grantees in need of additional resources. In the first round of reallocation, grantees that did not obligate 65% of their funds and also did not meet a 30% expenditure ratio by September 30th were determined to have excess funds. The expenditure ratio is the amount grantees have distributed divided by 90% of their total ERA1 allocation. The amount of funds recaptured was based on the difference between a grantee's expenditure ratio and the 30% threshold. The expenditure ratio benchmark increases each month, and Treasury intends to reevaluate grantees' expenditure ratio approximately every 2 months. So again, this reallocation marks the first of several rounds where Treasury will recapture excess ERA1 funds from programs that did not meet the required benchmarks and reallocate these funds to programs with additional need. Next slide. More than $1 billion was voluntarily reallocated in September, with $875 million going to grantees in the same state and $162 million going towards general reallocation. Another $91 million was recaptured from grantees who did not meet the required expenditure threshold and did not voluntarily reallocate funds. Next slide. 13 states and 4 local grantees voluntarily reallocated funds. 5 states voluntarily reallocated over $100 million, including Wisconsin, North Dakota, Indiana, Louisiana, and Tennessee. Because there are no local grantees in North Dakota, the state gave up a total of $149 million to a general fund. Within the other 4 states, the voluntarily reallocated funds went to local grantees within each state. 7 states and 14 local grantees had funds recaptured. Idaho, Montana, and Delaware had the largest amount of funds recaptured involuntarily, with $33 million, $22 million, and $11 million being returned respectively. Next slide. 125 programs received reallocated funds, including 5 states, 91 localities, and 29 tribes. The states that receive funds are California, New Jersey, New York, District of Columbia, and Oregon, with California receiving the most funds at $62.5 million. The 5 localities that receive the most funds include Indianapolis, Indiana, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Omaha, Nebraska, Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, and Maricopa County, Arizona. A full list of grantees that received reallocated funds is available in the links that I posted in the chat. Next slide. Due to the high amount of voluntarily reallocated funds, 81% of reallocated funds remained in the same state during the first round. This is comprised of 78% of ERA funds voluntarily reallocated within the same state and 3% of recaptured ERA funds reallocated within the same state. This is potentially promising for slow spending states who are able to reallocate their funds locally, as many local grantees have been more efficient in spending their allocations than their state counterparts. As a result, spending may pick up in places like Georgia, Arizona, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Wisconsin, where large amounts of funding was reallocated within the state. Only $209 million of the more than $1 billion in reallocated funds crossed state lines, making up 19% of the available funds. The small amount of funds available for reallocation across state lines, however, meant that some places with significant needs received far less than they requested. For example, the state of New York received only $27 million despite requesting $1 billion, and the state of Texas received nothing despite reports of them requesting $3 billion. Grantees that received less funding than requested may have the opportunity to receive additional funds in future rounds of reallocation, though it is not yet clear how Treasury is prioritizing grantees in the reallocation process. Next slide. We anticipate that the second round of reallocation will be based off of the recently released spending numbers for the month of November. Grantees must have reached an expenditure ratio of 40% to avoid recapture. According to NLHC analysis, 71 grantees are at risk of recapture, including 22 state grantees and 49 local grantees. Nearly $952 million is at risk of being recaptured, with $862 million coming from state grantees. The states estimated to lose the most funds are Georgia and Ohio, with nearly $119 million and $101 million at risk of recapture, respectively. We also looked at grantees who are at risk of recapture and do not have a local grantee that they can voluntarily reallocate funds to. Based on this, we estimate that there will be at least $328 million that may be available from low spending grantees to high spending out of state grantees. Next slide. Moving forward, we anticipate that Treasury will conduct another evaluation of grantees' expenditure ratios based on January spending data. Treasury will conduct a final assessment of each grantee's expenditure ratio based on March spending data. At this point, any unobligated ERA1 funds may be reallocated. Grantees have until September 2022 to obligate all their funds from their initial reallocation. Grantees that received reallocated funds may request an extension through December 2022 to continue obligating funds received through reallocation. Statutorily, the process for reallocating ERA2 funds cannot begin until March 2022. In a recent press release, Treasury stated that they will publish separate guidance for this reallocation. And we will be sure to keep you all updated once that guidance is released. Next slide. As always, if you have any questions about ERA spending or reallocation, please reach out at research@nlihc.org. Back to you, Joey.
Thanks so much for that excellent information, Sophie. It's great to know what's happening with all of the recaptures and so forth. I'm looking for some questions that came in. One comes from Peggy Lee. Are there any county breakdowns of funds that were recaptured?
Yes, if you look in the Treasury documents, they report based by grantee. So if a county is a grantee of ERA funds and they had funds recaptured, that will be in there. There's also cities that are ERA grantees who had funds recaptured.
Thank you, Sophie. And then another question from Tamara Caldas. You might not know if there are examples of this, but do we know of any litigation challenging a jurisdiction for failing to spend ERA funds at a certain minimum rate or level?
I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I can go back and with my team and ask and follow up with Tamara.
And I'll actually pose that question to everybody else here on the call. If you're aware of any potential litigations or legal challenges of misuse of ERA funds or underuse of ERA funds, we sure would love to learn about that for sure. Kate, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I don't think we've certainly talked to advocates who are in states where the states appear to intentionally be underutilizing their dollars or potential questions of misuse, but I don't think there's been any litigation on it as of yet.
Okay, great. Thanks for that update. And then final question I see here on emergency rental assistance is, are we able to draw any determinations on the failure of some jurisdictions getting out the money and needing reallocation? Jerry Pohe asks, does this say something specific about state and local infrastructure and current and future capacity supports that might be needed in communities?
Yeah, I can certainly link to some research that we've done around implementation and spending patterns. I will note that grantees are allowed to use 10% of their total allocation, including any reallocated funds, towards administrative expenses. So hopefully that will help alleviate any pressures that some grantees might experience to administering these funds, but I will link additional research.
Sophie, I'm pretty sure the answer to this question is no, but Sarah Barron posted a question in the chat box about would any given county receiving reallocated dollars be able to administer the new reallocated dollars any differently with regard to the service area? Would they be able to extend it beyond their county?
I don't believe so, but let me go back into the guidance and triple check and I'll follow up with Sarah.
Okay, that'd be great. Thanks so much for answering those questions, Sophie, and thank you for sharing all of this excellent information. And with that, I think we're going to move to the section of our agenda that often spotlights what's going on throughout the country. And the first field update this week comes from Paige Looney, who's a housing policy specialist in the state that remains at the top of everyone's thinking as it relates to Build Back Better Act, the West Virginia Coalition to End Homelessness. Paige is going to share a little bit about some of the work that they've been doing in West Virginia to continue to advance housing priorities and ending homelessness as it relates to getting Joe Manchin on board with this truly historic piece of legislation. So I am going to let Paige take it away and share about their efforts.
Hi guys, thanks for tuning in this afternoon, and thanks for that intro, Joey. Any House grantees on here, this might seem a little bit redundant to the last time I got to speak with you all, but yeah, just wanted to give you guys a bit of an overview on what we're doing in West Virginia, and as little insight as I can provide on Joe Manchin, if possible. So yeah, my name is Paige Looney. I am a housing policy specialist with the West Virginia Coalition to Homelessness. First things first, one of the bigger projects that we've taken on has been a series of op-eds earlier in the House campaign, but most recently published one on Christmas Eve in the Times West Virginian, which is Manchin's hometown newspaper. I thought it was a pretty good gift. It was also published in the Charleston Gazette Mail, which is the largest paper in the state and has the biggest reach. I'll share the link to that in the chat later, but the long and short of it is Manchin introduced a November resolution in the Senate calling for the month to be named National Homeless Children and Youth Awareness Month. We kind of pointed out that hypocrisy in having this opportunity to make such large investments in housing provisions and just to kind of fall short when he's been an advocate for child and youth homelessness before. Yes. Additionally, we have been doing a series of statewide billboards. Thank you to the NLIHC design team for helping me make these look pretty. That was pretty exciting. We've had success with billboards as an organization in the past. When we started our coordinated entry system, we got really good feedback from people being able to access our services for the first time just because they were able to visibly see them. So we figured this is a good way to keep that momentum up into things closer to lobbying. These are some of the places where we stationed those billboards. We had 6 across the state. The majority of the billboards get well over 50,000 impressions a week per spot. The one in Fairmont is literally located on the road to Manchin's Fairmont residence. And they ran from December 20th to the 16th. I promise you the billboard in Huntington does not look like that. It just does not render on camera for whatever reason. But that's the one in my hometown. This one gets well over 100,000 impressions per week per spot. And again, those ran to the 16th. As far as social media goes, I'll be the first to admit we don't have the most compelling social media presence as an organization, just because we haven't really delved into a lot of lobbying public perspective stuff before. Largely we just do direct service work, but we've got a wider reach on Facebook with 2.5 thousand likes or so, and from the 17th to January 8th we had daily posting with the HoUSed toolkit Build Back Better resources. We had greater reach towards the end of the campaign, but I'm looking forward to doing more things in that arena in the future. Upcoming and in progress projects that we've got going on right now. This is a large slide, so I apologize. Radio advertisements, yes, we still love our radio very much. We've got basically a radio campaign gearing up to follow that statewide billboard campaign. It'll get an estimated 173,000 general impressions. It'll have statewide coverage through Huntington, Parkersburg, and Wheeling. The majority of our messaging so far has been consistent with Manchin's concerns regarding youth and families. That's just something he's always prioritized. And we still want to focus on that, but kind of broaden it to like, what would you do if you didn't have to spend so much of your income on rent? Allowing us basically to have more conversations with other sectors of the economy and of what it means to be a West Virginian, and how all of this as a whole can be addressed by Build Back Better. HD Media Digital Advertising, it's just an advertising agency where we can have some statewide reach through different news outlets. We're additionally, and what I'm most excited for, we'll be coordinating with other statewide organizations and advocates, both within our network and within NLHC's Opportunity Starts at Home campaign. I'm mostly excited about this multi-sector approach from partners who work within healthcare, education, environment, disability rights, so on and so forth. We've already reached out to West Virginians for Affordable Healthcare and the National Association of Social Workers and their organization within West Virginia. We'll be reaching out to Mountain State Justice, Team for West Virginia Children, West Virginia ACLU, with the goal eventually being having a sign-on letter to send to Senator Manchin from organizations statewide, as well as publishing within the Charleston Gazette. Just a big, ominous, full-page advertisement, which I always find fun. Here's some final thoughts for you all. I know everyone and their mom has been talking about Joe Manchin for what feels like forever, and I know it's exhausting, but I think the question that we keep coming back to is what is on his mind, what is his goal? And the best resource I can point you guys to is an article by 100 Days in Appalachia, basically explaining that if you want to wrap your head around Joe Manchin, you have to kind of understand West Virginia politics. We spend very little time in the national spotlight, so when we do, it's hard to wrap our head around where he's coming from. He's a West Virginia Democrat. We've been a blue state for years and years and years, and that has started changing due to more conservative thinking being reflected within our population. He's socially and fiscally conservative, but falls upon like generations of Democratic and labor union support. It's interesting. He's still got this old school mindset, but the landscape has very much changed within West Virginia. He also, from what the article states and from what we understand within the state, there's this pressure to live up to the legacy of Robert C. Byrd and Rockefeller, his predecessors in the Senate. For better or for worse, they had a very big impact within the Senate and within the state. And I mean, he's been a political leader since the 80s, so there's a pressure to live up to that. Really good article. I'll attach it in the chat. I encourage you to give it a read if you're concerned with what we've got going on here. As far as culture goes, we're a red state, but we're also a populist state more than anything. I always reference this example. In 2016, during the primaries, Trump won the Republican primary by a landslide, but it was Bernie Sanders who won our Democratic primary just because of that anti-establishment sentiment. And I think that's reflected in pretty much all red states across the country. Manchin's current "I won't be bullied into voting for the Build Back Better Act" messaging is pretty reflective of West Virginian attitudes as a whole, for better or for worse. And this is when I kind of address you all as national organizations. If you have state partners in West Virginia, reach out to them and bolster the efforts of what they're doing, because it does mean so much more hearing from West Virginian organizations as opposed to national organizations as a whole, I think. Regardless of your feelings toward Joe Manchin, I promise you there are people who love the state and that are doing the work. I attached a photo at the bottom of some of our advocates literally kayaking to Manchin's yacht to advocate for Build Back Better. And there are people here doing the work and who care about this place. And hopefully that is echoed in some of the work we're doing and some of the partnerships we'll build with other organizations in the state. But if you have any questions, please send them my way. And thank you guys for tuning in.
Well, Paige, we're certainly all extremely grateful for the work that you've been doing at West Virginia Coalition to End Homelessness. It's never been more important to be an advocate in West Virginia, for sure. There's a lot of thanks and kudos coming along in the chat box. And a couple of folks have raised something you might want to expand on, just some suggestions for other partners you can work with to amplify this ask. Jan K in Illinois specifically mentioned the League of Women Voters. Josephine McNeil mentioned organizations in the Black community who are focused on voting rights, but can also talk about housing. I'm wondering if there's anything you'd like to share about efforts you've made to try to bring in coalition partners in this advocacy.
Yeah, absolutely. So largely I'm starting with organizations that have already signed on as supporters of Opportunity Starts at Home. There's a lot of support statewide for anything, any messaging that orients itself around labor and job provisions. So any construction unions or like community development opportunities, orienting it in that perspective as well. But thank you guys for the suggestions. I will absolutely do these things, and I appreciate your feedback.
All right, well, Paige, thank you so much for that presentation. And as I've said to other presenters, please do stick around and take a look at the Q&A box and the chat box to see if there are other questions that are asked that you can potentially answer. And so from there, we'll go to our next field update, which is from Tennessee. We're lucky to have with us Margaret Haltom, who is Program Supervisor for Neighborhood Preservation, Inc. NPI works out of Memphis, and Margaret's going to share some thoughts on what's going on with their eviction prevention efforts. So Margaret, take it away, please.
Thanks, Joey. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Margaret Haltom. I'm the Emergency Rent Assistance Program Director for Neighborhood Preservation, Inc. And we are the community partners working alongside the city and county government in Memphis, Tennessee. We are working to administer $90 million in ERA funds here. And today I'm going to talk about how we are accessing public court data to flag evictions across ERA applicants. And what I'm most excited about, how we are sharing that data with tenants. But first, some quick background on us. Our work as the community partner is primarily eviction prevention. So we're working to figure out who of the nearly 26,000 people who have applied to our local program are facing eviction, and then we're trying to pair them with free legal representation. To give you some context about this, Memphis historically has an eviction rate over twice the national average, and we were one of the first cities in the country to be unprotected by the eviction moratorium. So eviction hearings actually resumed here in March of 2021, right as we launched our ERA program. Since March, we've paired over 6,000 households facing eviction with legal representation. And what that means is that once these households were deemed eligible for the ERA, one of our 5 ERA attorneys reached out to their landlord attorney to negotiate a settlement and ask the landlord to drop any eviction filings or judgments against the tenants and required them to hold off on filing a new eviction for 45 days, among other tenant protections. Finally, I want to mention that 70% of these households who receive representation receive it through bulk settlements. So ERA attorneys have ongoing relationships with local landlord attorneys in Memphis, especially the 5 landlord attorneys who represent the majority of cases in Memphis. These ERA attorneys reach out to the landlord attorney. They say, here are all the tenants in properties you represent who are eligible for the ERA. Will you accept a payment for them? And this helps us speed up assistance. So you can see on the graph here that out of all of our ERA 1 funds, bulk settlements actually made possible 1/3 of all ERA 1 funds administered in Memphis and Shelby County, and 2/3 of all ERA funds administered that involved legal representation. And now that figure with our ERA 2 funds that we're well on our way through spending is higher at about 70%. 70% of all ERA funds administered that involved legal representation are through bulk settlements. So now the 2 initiatives that I'm going to talk to you all about today that I'm going to focus on are these court data initiatives, court data accessibility, that are changing our ability to prevent evictions and to stably house tenants, and that we think other local housing advocates might be interested in. So the first is how we use public court data to flag evictions across ERA applicants. And the second is how we share that data with tenants. So first, public court data. In Shelby County, we have a public court database, and it looks like this, where a tenant can search for their court information by their first and their last name. Now, it's not super easy to find or navigate, and the data is not accessible in bulk, but we pull from it through code that we can share with others that scrapes all the names that start with an A, names start with a B and a C, and then we match the list of people with upcoming evictions to the list of ERA applicants to flag which ERA applicants may have upcoming cases. And we put it all in this low-cost database that ERA attorneys use to access information about upcoming cases. So you can see here, our superstar attorney assigned to the case, Kayla, is in that first column. And then she keeps track of if she's settled the case, but she can also see the status of the case in the ERA system. She can see the eviction case number. She can see the date of the case in the court record. And if you're in our full database, you can see which courtroom the tenant will be in, who the plaintiff will be. This also helps attorneys triage whose case is upcoming and who needs immediate attention. And I want to thank our partners at US Digital Response. USDR is a pro bono tech group. They offer support to local governments and community partners. And they were the ones who helped us set up this low-cost Airtable. It's as cheap as $10 to $30 a month per user, and to make possible this quick use of public data for tenant representation. So now, the second piece, how we are sharing that data with tenants. So you can see here, this is what our postcards look like. We send a postcard to every address in the public record where a tenant has an eviction filed against them and where a tenant has a judgment taken, to notify the tenant, tell them what happened, and tell them ERA assistance is available. In addition, we are working with USDR again to roll out email and text notifications so that once we flag that a tenant who applied to the ERA has an eviction record, we will actually let the tenant know via an automated email and a text. And that message is going to tell the tenant what courtroom their hearing is in, what the date is. It'll give them a link to their personal court record, help them interpret what that court record says, and send them resources on when to show up to court, what to expect, what to wear. And the most important thing that this message is going to do is explain to them the backlog going on in our local courts. So there's currently a 3-month delay in cases due to court COVID exposures, and tenants will receive a reset notice like this in the mail. But many tenants don't know to expect this. Their initial detainer warrants and the data in their court record online actually doesn't say that they will receive this reset notice. Instead, their records will have a placeholder date, and that date is about 2 weeks out. So tenants often come to court on that date. They take off work, they pay $8 to park, only to find out that this wasn't their real case date. And a tenant actually recently told me he lost his job taking off to come in for this case date that wasn't correct. Other tenants have told me they didn't show up for the real hearing because they assumed the first hearing date was incorrect, so the second would be incorrect too. So we're trying to get the word out to tenants to explain when they're actually needed to show up and what to expect. And I want to end by first saying how much it means to be a part of the ERASE cohort, to be surrounded by ERA advocates who are working to improve these programs, to be with people who really get what it's like to be deep in the weeds on the day-to-day. And second, to share a really quick story with you. Over the last week, I've had COVID, and a tenant that I worked with to get an ERA payment in the last month reached out to me. She and I had worked to get her funds that she needed to relocate after she'd gotten an eviction judgment, and she was preparing for a set out. And she was just emailing me to tell me thank you, to tell me how much she liked her new place and how her boys were doing. And I told her that it made my day while I was in isolation. And she said, "Let me bring you something. Let me bring you soup. Just tell me what I can do for you." And I share this to say, in Memphis, we have seen that we can get the most out of this program when we think about it, not as a way to just help low-income tenants, but to help each other and to help our communities, to help our courts get people updated information about their hearings, to help our landlords recover rent they have lost, to help tenants in need who in turn are there to help us, to help ERA advocates get the support to improve their programs. So thank you all for this space to work to better these programs for our tenants and each other. And please reach out to me. I put my email in here if you want a demonstration of any of these tools, or to share resources, or to brainstorm together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Margaret, for sharing that excellent update, and thanks for being with us. Having so recently recovered from coronavirus, we really appreciate you being here. There's a lot of people in the chat box expressing appreciation for your work, and I don't see any questions right now. But with that, I would like to thank everyone once again for joining us today. This is going to be the end of our call, so we're finishing early. Please do join us next week. We're going to have some more updates, some more field spotlights for all of you, and please do take a look in your inboxes tomorrow for the follow-up notes from today's presentation, as well as the recording. I hope you're all doing great, and we hope to see you again next week. Bye.